This session will be chaired by Dr. Youngmi Kim, sorry. Dr. Kim is a senior lecturer, subject head for Korean Studies and director of Scottish Centre for Korean Studies in the University of Edinburgh. Dr. Kim, please go ahead.
Hi, thank you for organizing such fascinating and very timely seminars. We have 3 speakers on this title, The Role of World Society to Build Peace on Korean Peninsula. The first speaker is Dr. Michael Schluter, right? He's a president and CEO of Relational Peace Building Initiatives. Michael did his PhD in agricultural economics at Cornell University before working as a research fellow with International Food Policy Research Institute and economics consultant with the World Bank in East Africa. So Michael is an economist and social scientist who has launched a number of significant peace initiatives. The first was in South Africa. He then worked for 5 years after the genocide in Rwanda with a supporter of IFPRI. Thirdly, he organized and led the research for a consultation process between the major political parties and ethnic region leaders in North and South Sudan, in part financed by the US State Department. I think we can start with the first speakers. Dr. Schluter?
Yes, thank you very much. Yep. So thank you very much, Chairman, and thank you to the Republic of Korea Embassy in London and to the National Unification Advisory Council for this invitation and for hosting the session. I should say that relational peace building initiatives, which I refer to here as RPI, is relatively new to the Korean peace discussion. We hope we can contribute something useful based largely on our previous experience of running high-level track 2 discussions on socioeconomic issues to build trust, to support the track 1 political process in South Africa, and then in Sudan, especially those 2. We did 5 years in Rwanda, as you heard, and we also had some more recent experience in Ukraine. But we are very low profile. We have not generally sought any publicity for the work we've done because the nature of the discussions we held, influencing perspectives on policy and so on, usually have been behind the scenes. So you have to dig a little bit around to find out the history of what we've done. So if I move to the next slide, I'm going to look at 3 main areas here. One is just briefly to understand the nuclear threat, or how we should view it in our view, which may be a little different from most people. Secondly, why we think convergent development has to come first before any discussions about unification, which we still believe should be an ultimate objective for both DPRK and ROK, although we would like to see that happen probably faster than most people think. So we're talking 7 to 10 years, not 30, 40 years. And also we believe that convergent development, as we call it, that is the alignment of goals of the society and economic and social policies and institutions, those areas of convergent development have to precede any further discussions about unifications. So there's no quick fix to the Korean Peninsula. There has to be a 7 to 5 year process, a 5 to 7 year process, I should say, of convergence. Not so much convergence, but convergent development. So if I move now to our nuclear threat equation, as we call it. So we think it's important to understand that the scale of a nuclear threat to any country is a function of capability times motivation. So if you take the question of whether the UK is a nuclear threat to the United States, we have the capability in the UK, we have submarines capable of firing nuclear weapons, but we simply have no motivation. So capability 100, motivation 0, scale of nuclear threat is 0. Now, will North Korea ever denuclearize? They've made it quite clear that they never will. They've shouted it from the rooftops. That's what they're arguing. I'm not sure anybody's really listening to them on that. They think if they can increase the pressure enough, they will denuclearize. You can never prove it because a lot of it's underground and so on. But I think they look at places like Libya and they say, well, is this really the way to go? But is there some way to work on motivation? Well, we think there's a lot of ways to work on motivation, but it requires some fairly tough thinking, which I'm going to lay out quickly today. I'm sorry, this is a little bit of a rush through what is quite a complex argument. So why convergent development first? I think if I was a North Korean, I'd be looking at the German unification experience, which some of you will doubtless know better than me, but if I just point out that after unification, which came rather suddenly, there was massive unemployment in East Germany, partly due, of course, to the misguided effort to bring together the two currencies. Thousands of companies were liquidated, but more significantly, perhaps 30 years later, that's 2019, 47% of people living in East Germany still identified themselves more as East Germans than they did as Germans. That was an article in The Economist in October 2019. So also no positions were found for the former East German leadership in the new united Germany. So if there's going to be any meaningful discussions about unification, as we heard eloquently earlier from Dongjin Kim, there has to be reciprocal empowerment. There has to be an egalitarian environment created which involves mutual respect and mutual response. So the preconditions for convergent development are, we think, 3, which are set out in this equation here: shared narrative, a practical plan, and neighbor support. Now, as you can see here, there's a multiplication sign before you get to neighbor support. That is, if there's no neighbor support, even if you get a shared narrative between North and South Korea, and you have a practical plan, you won't achieve anything. So that's why this discourse today about the role of the worldwide community, from our point of view, is really important. So the shared narrative that we're talking about here is perhaps illustrated in this slide. And I remember Lord Brown, in a preliminary discussion we had before today's meeting, emphasizing the importance of shared narrative. It's an alignment, I think, of values, policies, and institutions. And it means that if you look at this slide here, significant changes are required by both ROK and DPRK. And that is deeply challenging, but to both the people and the leadership of those societies. I don't believe that there will ever be peace in the Korean Peninsula on a long-term sustainable basis by the assimilation option, which is still the dream of some people, probably on both sides of the DMZ. Now, I haven't got time to go into what might be these shared values. We will produce a much longer paper on this before long. There's a brief summary of these arguments on our website, relationalpeacebuilding.org, but you can see that we think that a shared narrative has to go back into a lot of religious and political philosophy and ideological traditions that are current in the Korean Peninsula. And we think that shared values can be derived, which would be acceptable to the majority of Koreans. We've laid out 5 on this slide, and I'm sorry there isn't time to discuss them. And we're not saying this is going to be the shared narrative. All we're saying is we're trying to say, yes, it is possible. And that discussions between North and South Koreans will come up with their own list of what these values should be. And of course, the real issue is how these things play out when you translate them into policy. But we think it is possible to develop shared values and shared policies and institutions. But secondly, if you go remember the equation, which was here, you not only need a shared narrative, but you do need a practical plan to put this into action, to make it happen. And that's been something we've been very interested in for some time. And we published a paper on our website on building trust and relationships in the Korean Peninsula, a mutually accepted economic and social convergent development process. And there are 5 elements of that, which again, I haven't got time to go into in this brief presentation, but please note it is a 7-year process. It involves a gradual opening of trade and financial flows. It involves an exchange of professionals, civil servants, and students. We've suggested 50,000 should cross over the DMZ from north to south and from south to north during the 7-year period, maybe starting in a very small way, and it involves international investment and technical support. But crucially, you'll see number 3, how do we persuade, or how can North and South Korea persuade, I should say, the UN and the US to provide these sanctions exemptions? And we've suggested that there are 4 conditions that they should offer to satisfy. So they need to come together, we believe, DPRK and ROK, and say, yes, we do want to do this. We do want a convergent development process. And this is what we're asking for, that sanctions exemptions, not lifting of all sanctions, but sanctions exemptions are offered only between DPRK and ROK, that they should be one sector at a time. So you might take agriculture first. That would last for 6-9 months while there was time to create, the next bullet point, the joint goals for the sector agreed. But then after 6 or 9 months, you might open up not just agricultural trade and investment between North and South Korea, but then say investment in the health sector or humanitarian aid and the transfer of professionals and everything else for training. But then after that, you might move on to business or infrastructure or transport. I mean, North and South Korea would decide themselves what sector they wanted to go first or second or third. But these sanctions exemptions would only be given by the US, the UN, Security Council, and so on, if various confidence building measures are in place. What might those confidence building measures be? I'm not a track 1 expert. I'm more, I would say, of a track 2 specialist, but one might think of the comprehensive military agreement of 2018 as a starting point, but certain things that assure the world, and where DPRK and ROK assure each other that there will be safety and security during the 7 years of this agreement while this is taking place. So I think this is a crucial point I want to make here in this discussion today. And that is that I think that if there is going to be some shared narrative in the Korean Peninsula, then ROK has to be willing not just to reach out with nice words to North Korea, not only to spend a lot of money thinking about how they could support North Korea if they decided to go to a liberal democracy and a modern Western type of economy. No, I think they have to think about what changes they need to make internally to align their own institutions, their own policies, to be closer to those of North Korea in certain respects. And the areas I particularly want them to think about in ROK, and I hope it won't seem impertinent of me, Ambassador Park, to make these suggestions to the ROK embassy here today, but we think South Korea has to be willing to pay some cost to get real negotiations. So North Korea takes family much more seriously than South Korea. You'll be aware that South Korea has the lowest birth rate in the world, a falling marriage rate as well, even now, and it will actually annihilate itself from the planet by about 2000. The 22nd century. I think they'll be down to 3 million people unless they can reverse the birth rate. But family policy is not just about a few fiscal policies. It's about looking at the number of hours that people spend at work. It's about the priority given to competition in the schools. It's about changing educational curriculum and culture, which is fiercely individualistic and competitive. And South Korea may say, well, this has served us really well. Look, we were one of the poorest countries in the world in 1960. Now we're one of the richest countries in 2020. But it isn't going to bring you peace in the Korean Peninsula, because there is nothing in the curriculum about learning what we call relational literacy, about learning to think about the factors that influence other people's thinking, how they see things. And with very little time available to be spent in families, where do children learn to think about how other people see the world? They just become very self-focused, very ambitious, very much personally goal-driven through the education system. And that means you will never reach true long-term peace with the North unless you're willing to change elements in your education system and in your family policy. And I would say also in your corporate governance, because the goal of companies, as far as I can see, and I've studied corporate governance a great deal, but not enough yet in the South Korean context, but certainly we're shortly putting out a book in the UK on this issue. But corporate governance is very much still based on shareholder value in South Korea. It's not around how does a company serve the interests of wider society? How does it build social capital? How does it support family policy? There's no stakeholder understanding in South Korean corporate governance. And those sort of things will have to change if South Korean companies are going to be accepted in North Korea, not as people simply trying to make profits for their shareholders or owners, but as organizations that are dedicated to trying to improve the common good. And of course, big challenges to defense and security policies. If 50,000 North Koreans are to come and live in South Korea over 7 years, how is the security service going to actually track all those people? I mean, huge changes in thinking needed by South Korea. Now, the benefits, of course, are huge. It helps South Korea navigate increasingly global regional tensions, perhaps a Cold War between China and the US, but all of these regional tensions are more easily coped with if South Korea will shift some aspects of its individualistic culture. There are domestic political imperatives. There are people who want to meet their relatives in North Korea. There's the Moon administration's commitment to unification as a fundamental part of its political agenda. There's a yearning by many South Koreans, by no means all, many younger South Koreans now are just more interested in their own careers than in a Korean Peninsula kind of consideration. But there are a very strong constituency still in South Korea who long for unification. So there are domestic political imperatives. There are wonderful economic growth possibilities if there could be some convergent development, and it's hard to see why South Korea is otherwise going to maintain its economic growth and its momentum in its economy unless it starts to open up relations with DPRK and all of the trade possibilities with Russia, Japan, China, and so on, which could develop out of that. And I've mentioned here it avoids long-term demographic annihilation. I mentioned the numbers, but by 2056, South Korea will have a population on current projections, which I think are a bit optimistic now, given the continuing fall in the birth rate. But by 2056, the South Korean population will be 40 million. By 2100, it will be 20 million. And by 2200, it will be 3 million. But also, there are costs to DPRK of accepting this process. For example, their agricultural sector strategy is based on food self-sufficiency. Now, perhaps it's got to be simply on giving people enough income to buy food for themselves, whether that food is grown in South Korea or somewhere else. perhaps Juche has to be rethought or redefined in some ways. There are changes in education curriculum, perhaps less emphasis on the ideology of the state and more emphasis again on relational literacy, that kind of area. Again, forms of business and land ownership need to be reviewed, a less role for the state, perhaps looking at Chinese land reforms. And again, issues around security policies, which are very challenging. Hence, it probably needs to start in one province between North and South Kangwon, for example, a whole process of change. But there are challenges and costs to DPRK of making these coming to a shared narrative. And equally, there are huge benefits, the respect for DPRK identity, release from the sanctions stranglehold gradually over the 7 years, a route to rapid modernization, acceptance back into the international community. And there is no precondition of denuclearization. There may well be denuclearization at the end of the process as part of a wider political settlement, but that's another issue for the future. So the change equation is that when change comes about is where dissatisfaction with the status quo and a vision of future benefit and the first steps that are clear become greater than or equal to the cost of change. And I think it's important to realize that in DPRK, there may well be now a great deal of dissatisfaction with the status quo among the leadership, as well as more widely. I think it is possible here through what we have proposed and through other possible avenues like it to produce first steps. The hard thing is to get to the vision of future benefit in terms of a shared narrative with South Korea. Is South Korea willing to make the changes that they need to make in order to have a shared vision of the future, which I think DPRK will feel is essential before they're willing to really let their guard down and really openly build relationships. There must be some vision of what the future could look like with ROK that is really attractive to them. There's no way they are going to, in our view, come to the table on the basis of assimilation. They want mutual empowerment, mutual recognition, mutual respect. So what is the role of the world society? I've come a long way around to get to the subject, but to show respect for DPRK, as well as ROK, identities and achievements. The technological miracle in North Korea with these nuclear weapons, it is astonishing that they've been able to do it, as well as the ROK financial, economic miracle. The support for the sanctions exemptions, investment, technical support, and I believe a long-term dream, support for the idea of a unified Korea being a little bit like a Switzerland in East Asia, a multi-connected neutral state in the long term. So convergent development, going back to where we started, is a function of shared narrative plus a practical plan on the one hand, and getting that neighbor support on the other. So we believe this leads to long-term harmony because it depends on a new relationship between DPRK and ROK, where ROK doesn't constantly respond negatively to ROK. I don't know whether it sees itself treated too much like a younger brother. I don't know what it is, but there's somehow something wrong in the dynamic of ROK communication, I think. There are issues around regional harmony, depending on the acceptance of Korean values and policy goals. Harmony in Korea will potentially contribute in a major way to harmony in the whole region. And I finished with saying, just as one more critical ingredient from our experience, Archbishop Tutu, who ran the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, wrote a wonderful book called No Future Without Forgiveness. Public forgiveness is too little talked about in the peace building area, we believe. It is a crucial ingredient if there's going to be harmony between Japan and Korea, and Japan and China, and between North Korea and South Korea, And all of these countries in the region and beyond, there has to be forgiveness on all sides for all kinds of wrongs in the past, a willingness to apologize, but also a willingness to forgive. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much. Thank you.